Wow, thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Dr. Karani. Thank you guys so much for having me. I know this is also your lunch hour, so please feel free to eat, take breaks as you need. I'm just going to share my screen. I'll present for about 40 minutes, and I hope we can have like 20 minutes of just reflections, discussion, any questions that you have, so it can be a little interactive as well. Give me 1 second to share. Okay. So I titled today's presentation An Anti-Racist Imperative for Medicine, because I think there is truly an urgency for us to talk about how we are going to address racism effectively across our field. And so that will be the central thrust of our presentation today. At the bottom of this first slide, I left my Twitter handle, which is also my Gmail address if you add @gmail to the end. If there are questions we don't have time to get to, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or at my Gmail, and we can chat more. I don't have any disclosures. So let's get started. If we're going to talk about the urgency of anti-racist agendas in medicine, it's critical for us to first understand the effect that racism has on people and communities. Here, I think it's really helpful to turn to the words of author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote in his book, Between the World and Me, but all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. We must never look away from this. We must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body. Whether that violence is the physical violence of policing or the structural violence of inaccessible healthcare, racism is experienced and embodied as violence. And that's why we have to be urgent about addressing it. As colleagues and I said in Health Affairs this past summer, racism remains a bloodying force that truly structures every facet of life in this country. And if we're honest, it structures every facet of my practice of pediatrics and your practice of medicine. In short, racism kills people, and that's why we have to come to address it. That's never been more clear than as we witness the racial health inequities that have emerged throughout the pandemic. This is data from APM Research Labs that looks over the last month and year to look at what has happened to mortality rates by racial and ethnic group. And the first thing you'll notice is that instead of mortality rates narrowing, they continue to widen. Now what we see is that Indigenous populations have the highest COVID mortality rate, far and away higher than any other racial or ethnic group in the country, followed by Black folks in this country, who are followed closely by Pacific Islanders. I think often when we talk in the national conversation about racial health inequities, particularly during the pandemic, the narrative about what's happening to Pacific Islanders often gets lost, but they have the third highest COVID mortality rate, followed then by Latinx and white populations, and then by Asian populations. If we then overlap, who has access to at least one dose of a COVID vaccine? We see that Black folks and Latinx populations are second to last and last, despite having disproportionately higher COVID mortality rates. This is data from Kaiser Family Foundation, who then compares the rate of vaccination in white and Hispanic populations to the rate of vaccination in white populations. And as you can see, and I'll put a little red box here, white populations are vaccinated at a rate 1.6 times higher than Black populations in this country, and 1.7 or 1.6, I think is the most recent figure, higher than Latinx populations as well. And so when we see these differences, we have to ask ourselves, are they evidence of simple disparities, which are just population level differences in a health outcome? Or are they evidence of inequities, which are population level differences in a health outcome that are completely preventable? And because they're preventable, they're unjust. What we've witnessed during this last, 16, 18 months of the pandemic are health inequities, and we should refer to them as inequities. So where do health inequities come from? Health inequities arise when certain populations are made vulnerable. And I put that in red and in bold just to remind us, no racial group is innately or genetically more vulnerable to diseases like COVID than any other. People are made vulnerable. And usually that happens through the inequitable distribution of protections to keep folks from getting sick, as we are watching happen month after month with the COVID vaccines, or through the inequitable distribution of supports to treat sickness and ameliorate all of the adverse consequences that accompany prolonged illness, like the economic burdens that we saw accompany the pandemic. And so despite knowing where health inequities come from, we still, this far into the pandemic, continue to publicly contextualize who's most at risk for COVID based on risk factors like these. Things like chronic underlying illness, advanced age. Most states who distributed the COVID vaccine began mostly with the elderly as the cutoff to determine who should get prioritized access, or social factors like poverty. But when we contextualize it in this way, what we miss is that residential segregation has profoundly shaped the racial distribution of heart disease in the country. And chronic exposures to discrimination increases rates of hypertension within communities of color. Or how environmental racism literally determines who breathes in clean air and who breathes in toxins, and thus shapes the racial distribution of chronic lung disease like COPD. Or how the racial wealth gap profoundly concentrates poverty within communities of color. Or how toxic stress and early exposures that extract caregivers from the lives of children can raise their allostatic load, which means raise the wear and tear on their organ systems that ultimately weathers their cells, which is a term from researcher Arlene Geronimus. So if a person has weathered cells, it means their cellular age could actually be advanced of their chronological age, and they could be at risk for complications from a disease like COVID at much younger ages than expected. These are all examples of how structural racism has shaped the racial distribution of the pandemic. This is a definition of structural racism from one of my favorite pediatricians, Dr. Kamara Jones, who notes that it refers to the differential access folks have to goods, services, and opportunities by race. And as a result, inherited disadvantage, not just inherited disease, comes to shape the racial distribution of this pandemic. Taken together, it's the physical, but also the structural, the legal, the policy environment in which humans grow, learn, work, and play shapes not only our health, but the health of our children and our children's children. And so when we're talking about the inequitable risk of COVID, and I put a star by risk here just to remind us that we're thinking at the population level about systematic drivers that shape outcomes for groups, not at the individual level where an individual's choices shape their individual outcome. At the population level, the risk for COVID is not simply summarized by words like poverty or underlying illness or even advanced age. Instead, this disproportionate and inequitable risk reveals legacies and current practices right now of racial exclusion, discrimination, disinvestment, and violence that concentrates disadvantage in communities of color, creates adversity for children of color that follows them across their life course, and shapes population level opportunities to be well, and provides the perfect conditions for folks who live in segregated communities of color to be sicker in this country. That's why, despite COVID-19 becoming the third leading cause of death last year, researcher Elizabeth Wrigley Field projected that white mortality would remain less than what Black Americans experienced every year pre-pandemic. This is a figure from the New York Times that adapted Elizabeth Wrigley Field's research. And what it shows in that dotted line is the alarming projected jump in white mortality as a result of COVID. And then what you see above it is the enormous chasm that still exists between that elevated white mortality and baseline Black mortality in this country. This chart doesn't even include Indigenous mortality, which has the highest baseline mortality rate in this country. And so, as early as August of last year, Elizabeth Wrigley Field said racial inequality is as deadly as COVID-19, because in such a deadly year, when we were in the middle of the worst pandemic we've seen in a century, she projected that white life expectancy would remain higher than Black life expectancy has ever been in this country. And by February of this year, we knew she was right. In the first half of 2020, life expectancy fell for all US Americans by a year. But if you look closely, it fell the greatest for non-Hispanic Black populations, who lost 2.7 years on average of their lifespan last year. You can also see for Hispanic populations, they lost 1.9 years, and non-Hispanic white populations lost 0.8 years. If we then disaggregate that data by race and gender, we see that Black men and women had the greatest declines in their life expectancy over the last year. Black men lost 3 years, and Black women lost 2.3 years of their lifespans. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are those legacies and current practices that contribute to these enormous chasms in life chances that persist even now? Often when we think of those legacies, we go back to times like this, to the Jim Crow South and segregated public accommodations like water fountains is in this picture, or even bus depots. But we don't as often go back to this time. This is a picture from 1967 in Newark, New Jersey, in what historians now refer to as the long hot summer of 1967. They call it the long hot summer because during that summer, there were 169 race massacres all across the United States, all sparked by an event of police violence against a Black taxi driver in Newark, New Jersey. When we talk about the chasm in life chances that exist in this country, we rarely frame it around what it feels like to be this little Black boy who's walking down his own city block with his government at his back. That's the National Guard who was called in, and their guns are drawn and his hands are up because he doesn't feel safe. We don't talk about what it's like to live as the Black women who line this photo on the right side, some of whom also have their hands up, who are not intervening because they also don't feel safe. Or on the left side of this photo, I don't know if you can see these other little boys who are just looking back at a boy who's just like them. And they're understanding something specific about what it means to be Black and a boy in this country. We rarely frame how we understand the chasm in life chances that exist in this country around the devastation that state violence has caused to communities of color generally and to Black communities in particular. And we need to, because too little has changed since 1967. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning photo that covered Time magazine in 2015. It's by photographer Devin Allen, and it's capturing the aftermath after police murdered Freddie Gray in Baltimore. And he asked that question then, how much has changed? Coming off our own summer of uprisings last summer, many of us continue to ask that question. How much is fundamentally different in this country? And what is the cost to the communities of color that have borne that intergenerational burden of violence? And so when we're talking about the forces that shape the pandemic, we absolutely have to talk about police violence. So what do we know about police violence? We know that about 1,000 people are killed by police every year, which averages out to about 3 people every day. We also know that it's a particularly deadly exposure for Black men and boys, of whom the National Academy of Sciences told us in 2019, 1 in 1,000 will be killed by police in their lifetime. 1 in 1,000. I always share this figure when I talk to other pediatricians because 1 in 1,000 is also the mortality rate of measles. And when you think about the near constant public health surveillance and investment we as a society have placed in eradicating measles because we deem it that deadly, and you compare it to the relative little to nothing we as healthcare systems and we as a public health infrastructure in this country have done to eradicate police violence, We seize the ways that racism not only shapes deadly exposures, in this case for Black men and boys, but more broadly for communities of color, but it also shapes our lack of response in healthcare. So we have to come to understand and advocate against police violence the way we understand and advocate against community violence, because it is a form of community violence. This is data from researcher Ali Silwell, who told us that for folks who live in neighborhoods where Black or Latinx civilians are killed by police, the women, particularly in that neighborhood, have higher rates of hypertension, diabetes, and obesity. Think back to those underlying risk factors that we said drives your risk for complications from COVID. Simply living in a neighborhood where police kill folks who look like you drives some of those chronic conditions, particularly for women, which is an incredibly nuanced way for us to understand the ways that police violence also harms women. We often share narratives about police violence that center the stories of men, and that can be incredibly important so that we uplift their lives. But it's critical that we also understand that women are victims of police violence, women are indirect witnesses to police violence, and women carry the intergenerational physiologic burden of living in neighborhoods that are lethally surveilled, which is a term from Ali Silwell. We also know that women can be affected by police violence based on their immigration status. This is a 2018 study that looked at women who are born in Mexico but reside in the United States, and it found that worrying about deportation also increases risks for obesity and high blood pressure, which again could drive people's risk for complications from diseases like COVID. And so ultimately, we have to understand that racism is a devastating root of chronic, undertreated disease and completely preventable premature death. And so, if we're going to respond at scale to racism as the public health crisis that it truly is in this country, we have to be able to name racism as a driver of racial health inequities and poor health outcomes. Then we have to be able to identify the mechanism by which racism works to do that. And then we have to explicitly eliminate racism through each of those mechanisms. When it comes to naming racism, we as a field have historically done a poor job. This is a 2018 systematic review by Rachel Hardiman and colleagues who looked at the 50 highest impact journals and found that between 2002 and 2015, only 25 articles across these 50 journals named institutionalized racism in the title or abstract. And what's worse, only 16 of those 25 articles actually included institutionalized racism as a core concept in the paper. Just this last week, colleagues and I extended that methodology to look at four of the top leading medical journals in the world, BMJ, JAMA, New England Journal, and The Lancet. And we extended the date from 1990 to 2020, so looking over a 30-year span. And what we found is that of the more than 220,000 articles that were written in that 30-year period, less than 1% were empirical investigations that actually measured racism, determined the impact of racism, or tested how to address racism. Less than 1%. We compared those articles then to how much has been published in the American Journal of Public Health, just to provide evidence that there has been science that's been done. There is a wealth, a behemoth, one might say, of research telling us that racism harms health. It's just that our top medical journals don't seem to prize that resource and prioritize it for publication. Since May 2020, something has shifted, not just in publications, which is for most of those journals when most of them have published predominantly opinion pieces about racism, but also across our fields. If we look at the Council of Medical Specialty Societies, which is the group that many of our professional associations belong to, we can see that most physicians' professional associations have made statements over the last year condemning racism and acknowledging its harms. And yet, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a single national medical association or hospital association that's released a statement publicly acknowledging white supremacy and its harms. So we're going to talk a little bit about whiteness because I think too often we don't talk about it. It becomes absently present, to use the words of Diana Gustafson, and it becomes normative, Despite the fact that whiteness shapes all of our access to rights and resources, we often don't name it. And so we're going to name it today. So what is it? First, it's different than white, right? White is a racial status that's just based on someone's perceived skin tone. Whiteness describes the structural apparatus that then affords folks certain privileges or advantages based on their perceived skin tone or racial grouping. Over time, through laws and norms, what that does is it empowers, normalizes, favors, and rewards white folks as a population. I underline as a population there because it's important to acknowledge that individual white folks absolutely shape and face hardships in their lives. It's why I use this image of somebody getting a boost over a wall, because that's, in a certain sense, how whiteness works structurally. It's this structural boost that people can get above the hardships in their lives. I'll give you two examples. We know that when compared to white populations, Black populations have lower levels of wealth at every level of income. Or when compared to white populations, Black populations have lower opportunities for employment at every level of education. Those are examples of how whiteness works as a boost above an individual white person's level of income or above their level of education, such that they can have disproportionate access to wealth and employment in ways that other racial and ethnic groups are excluded from. And so it works in predominantly four ways. So we are going to go through the four ways that whiteness works that I kind of laid out in one of the papers I wrote in the Lancet. So the first way is white hegemony. White hegemony refers to forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that establish and enforce racial hierarchies in which white folks nearly exclusively hold decision-making power. The House of Medicine in this country is a white hegemony, and we're going to go through some of that data. White supremacy refers to forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that create and maintain a racial ordering or racial hierarchy of humans and resources that reinforces the racial dominance of whites. White privilege refers to forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that preference white folks through disproportionate access to resources associated with mobility. And white normativity refers to forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that naturalizes power asymmetries between white and non-white folks as being primarily meritocratic. This is where we say, well, the reason white folks occupy most positions of power in medicine is because they deserve it more than other groups. They meet the criteria better than other groups. So if we look at that criteria and we see what it's got us, we can see that across healthcare, when we look at hospital leadership and governance, by far and away, white folks have the most decision-making power in our field. This is data from AHA that was published just last year. And this includes hospital board membership and executive positions. AHA also did a study looking back over time to say, how much has changed over the last decade or so? And what we see is that it's not just that white folks make up the lion's share of CEOs and executive leadership, they also make up the lion's share of board members and first and mid-level managers. And when they looked over time, those numbers haven't changed at all. If we had a language to talk about how whiteness and the structural advantages and privileges that whiteness affords white populations works in our own field, we might have also been able to correctly diagnose what happened last summer on state house lawns across the country. This is a picture from my state house lawn that was run in the Los Angeles Times that showed the mostly white gatherings, or protests as some might have called them, where people were decrying the public health guidelines. In my state, it was illegal to gather in groups greater than 10. We had a mask mandate. And so this gathering in many ways was against and publicly defiant of, at that time, existing law. As a result of their open defiance of the law, were these groups viciously attacked by the police? Were they pepper sprayed and tear gassed and dragged out, some physically harmed? Was anybody shot by the police and killed at these events? Not a single person was arrested. Nobody was injured. Nobody was harmed by the police, and they were allowed to gather in this way. And so if we had had the language in healthcare, we could have said this not only was a risk to people's health because they gathered in these groups during a pandemic, but it was a demonstration of their whiteness. Because what their whiteness allowed them was the ability to defy the law in open view without any recourse, without any punishment, which then reinforces a certain privilege of whiteness, which is protection from police brutality and violence. And if we had understood what happened over the summer, we might have been able to predict what happened on January 6th. We don't talk enough, honestly, in my opinion, about the insurrection and about what it revealed about a wide swath of our country. This gathering, obviously, again, is at risk of people's public health because they're gathering in these groups, many unmasked. But it's also clearly a risk to our democracy and another enormous display of whiteness. Because here people are gathering to demonstrate that they are the only population that should have the right to choose who the president is, which is a way of supporting their exclusive rights to citizenship in ways that other groups, particularly Black folks in this country, have had to fight to have for years. And so we have to come to acknowledge as a field, as we reckon with racism, we have to come to acknowledge white supremacy's dangers as well. As colleagues and I said in The Lancet, white nationalism and authoritarianism undermines democracy. And democracy is foundational for any of us to have a chance at equal access to rights and resources. And equal access to rights and resources is foundational to health. And then the social, economic, and political conditions necessary to advance equality ultimately safeguard the planet. And so when we say that white supremacy is dangerous, we don't just mean it's dangerous to our democracy. As a result of being dangerous to our democracy, it's dangerous to the notion of equality and the prospect of equality in this country, which makes it dangerous to public health, which makes it dangerous to the vitality of the planet. For folks who are interested in learning more about the ways that whiteness not only can portend certain advantages for groups, but also critical health disadvantages, I highly recommend this book by psychiatrist Dr. Jonathan Metzl, who works at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. In full disclosure, I reviewed this book for The Lancet back in January of last year, but I think it's a really profound testament to the ways that whiteness can also harm the health of white folks too. And so when we're talking about how racism works, we also have to become more nuanced to understand the ways that white supremacy also harms the health of white folks, often by shrinking the pot of rights and resources available to everybody on the hopes that it mostly shrinks the pot available to groups who are non-white, without recognizing that it will shrink the pot for the public at large. And so once we name racism and we name white supremacy as harmful to health, we have to identify the mechanisms by which it works. And again, if we remember, racism works through legacies and current practices of racial exclusion, discrimination, disinvestment, and violence. And I use this disturbing picture from inside the Capitol building at the moment of insurrection, just to illustrate how close what we thought of as legacies are to what we can understand as current practices, as you can see through this depiction of the Confederate flag and the hats supporting our former president. If we don't identify how racism works, the tacit assumption is that it's something about that individual, right? And we've come through a generation of that type of analysis, where instead of saying there is something structurally wrong with how our nation serves the needs and how our health systems serve the needs of communities of color, instead we have located the problem on individuals. And we've said something's wrong with your choices. Perhaps it's your cultural choices to eat certain foods or to move in the world in certain ways. And what that does is it reinforces patient blame, right? Instead of acknowledging our system's failures, we then blame patients for the reasons that they're sicker. One common and generally accepted manifestation of patient blame is the undue focus we as a field have had on patient mistrust as a potential driver of racial health inequities. As colleagues and I said in Health Affairs this past summer, while patient trust certainly shapes healthcare use behaviors and is an important part of the patient-physician relationship, persistent racial health inequities across nearly every major health index, including all of the ones in the pandemic, reveal less about what patients have failed to feel, trust, and more about what our systems have failed to do, which is address racism and become trustworthy. To be clear, patient trust will never solve racial health inequities or narrow gaps in health outcomes. And I want people to understand that. Patient trust is not the solution to racial health inequities, right? It's the byproduct of us addressing racism. So we have to be honest about the fact that patients' mistrust, which is a narrative that we've often heard kind of elevated when we saw the inequities that existed in COVID vaccine access, that perhaps it's mistrust among Black patients that has shaped their lack of access to the COVID vaccine. That sleight of hand is a backsliding into patient blame that we have to resist at all cost because it's simply not true. Patient trust is neither necessary nor sufficient to procure any type of medical care in this country or the COVID vaccines. And so we have to acknowledge that eliminating racism is what closes those gaps. And we can only eliminate it if we identify the mechanisms that it's working by. And so if we're going to respond at scale, we actually have to move towards abolition of racism. Often when we think about addressing racism, we're kind of centering between these two paradigms or camps, right? Many of us are moving from talking about equal resource distribution to equitable resource distribution, right? Because the first figure, when you look at equality, provides kind of the same resource to everybody, but the figure is attempting to demonstrate that people have differing levels of need. And so an equitable approach would then provide resources commensurate with patients' or communities' level of need. But if we turn to the words of scholar and abolitionist Angela Davis, I think this image has become a reflection of how difficult it is for us to envision a social order and our own advocacy strategies that don't rely upon the fence. Even equity doesn't ask us to eliminate the fence. Instead, it says, in the face of the fence, let's distribute resources according to need. And so if we're going to talk about abolishing racism, we actually have to get into the business of eliminating fences, right? To do that, we first have to center at the margins, which is a lesson from critical race theory, which means we have to place ourselves within the perspective of those most impacted. And to do that, it means we have to listen to the communities most impacted. When we do that and we reorient ourselves in this figure, the first thing you notice is you can't even see the baseball game. People don't even know the resources that we are keeping from them because of their positionality. This is a figure that is drawn by artist Aria Galili from a paper by Nicholas Barcelo, who's a psychiatrist and researcher at UCLA. And what it shows so aptly is that nobody is innately short. Remember the other figure where people had varying heights? Implicitly, what that teaches us is that there's something innately and perhaps maybe even genetically different about groups who have different social needs. But that's not the case at all, right? Instead, groups are divested in, and so they are made to live from a whole. Other groups are ensnared in the criminal justice system, which keeps them from having equal access to public goods like public housing, applying and being eligible for food programs like food stamps, or sometimes in some states, even being able to vote. And in the setting of certain groups being disadvantaged, other groups are artificially advantaged and giving a box so that they can see what's on the other side. When we say that when we said as a country, and we saw all these headlines that said, Black folks in particular are quote unquote vaccine hesitant, and it's their mistrust from things like Tuskegee that drives their lack of access. All I could think about was this picture. that nobody who said that actually centered in the experience of Black folks to see how hard it was for Black folks to get a vaccine and still now to get a vaccine. The most recent data from APM Research Labs shows us that Black folks actually have the least access to the COVID vaccine right now. As a racial and ethnic group, we are the population who has the least amount of vaccines. And so what this figure helps us understand is the ways that racial inequality is constructed. It's created and it's perpetuated, and we in healthcare often participate. We do that because racism is profitable. This is a great paper that was in Annals of Internal Medicine in 2019, and it looked specifically at the business practices at academic health centers. And it looked at 3 practices in particular, but we're going to look at the wage disparities one. What they found is that low-wage jobs in healthcare are disproportionately held by Black laborers. So at the same time that we as a country are having a conversation about whether we should raise the wage to $15, and just after President Biden raised the federal minimum wage to $15, we in healthcare, a sector that makes up 17% of the GDP, such an enormous part of our nation's production, we have employees who make less than $15 an hour. And what this paper found is that approximately half of Black female healthcare workers earn less than $15 an hour, which is a percentage almost double that of their white counterparts. And so we're going to close by talking a little bit about how we can then come to understand anti-racism. And the first thing I want people to understand is that it's not a set of values. It's not your intentions. It's not what you reflect on. It's not what you believe. Anti-racism is what you do. And that's how we know when people participate in anti-racism or when they don't. And often the ways that people further racism is simply by doing nothing. And it's what many of our healthcare centers are doing. In addition to participating in types of business models that might further racism, as we kind of reviewed briefly, we also aren't doing enough to actually confront forms of racism, police violence being a prominent one. And so the first thing anti-racism calls us to do is do more than just be passive within systems that are harming others. And that's a quote from Ijeoma Oloyu. So we have to recognize that valuing difference, even for all the talk about diversity, that doesn't actually address racism. This is again data from AHA, the American Hospital Association. And what they found is that hospitals are collecting data about race and ethnicity, but very few are actually using that data to shape quality improvement standards, to understand who suffers disproportionate medical errors, and to address CMS's core measures. Again, it doesn't matter if we simply value diversity if we're not about analyzing the ways that racism works, identifying the mechanism by which it works, and then seeking to address it specifically by applying it to medical errors, hospital readmissions, or our quality indicators. One of the processes that we need to go through as a field is truth, reconciliation, and reparations, and these 3 things go together. Truth recognizes that we as systems have to acknowledge the ways in which we have participated in, benefited from, profited from, and remained passive around forms of racism. Reconciliation says then we have to explicitly apologize for each of those ways. And then reparation says we then have to explicitly address each of those ways our systems have benefited from or profited from or remained passive around forms of racism. Often truth and reconciliation and reparations is treated as this long-term project that's just too overwhelming to begin. So I wanted to use this example from here in California that shows that we in healthcare know how to do this extremely well. At Stanford, when they rolled out the vaccine, they came under fire because they prioritized emeritus professors based on age over residents. Emeritus professors were at home and were not in direct patient care, and residents were in direct patient care being exposed to COVID every day. And so residents protested. They got the attention of the media. This is a picture from NPR, and this is the statement the hospital released. Immediately, they took full responsibility. They told the truth. Hey, you guys are right. They profusely apologized, reconciliation to everybody who was affected. They said we should have acted more swiftly to address this error. And we're working to address it, and we will switch who gets vaccines in 1 week. The first COVID vaccines were approved on December 11th. We still see racial health inequities that are widening and persisting in who has access to that vaccine. What health system has said, we will fix that in a week? We have to talk about our lack of urgency to actually address racism when it affects the populations we serve and not just us, right? Stanford could do this because it affects their workforce, it affects their laborers, and obviously their reputation. But why doesn't it affect hospitals' reputation when we reliably recreate health inequities in how we deliver things like vaccines? The other thing that we can think through is what it might mean for our hospital systems to become sanctuaries. I started thinking more about this concept after Harvard public policy scholar, Professor Leah Wright Rigueur, said this sentence back early in the pandemic on a panel I was on with her. She said, Black folks live without sanctuary in this country. And when I thought about it, it was just like, oh my gosh, she's right. And just over the last 12 months, we have all publicly witnessed just how devastating that is. Breonna Taylor was shot and killed on her own sofa in her own home. She could not avoid the violence of policing. If we remember Tamir Rice, 12 years old in Cleveland, was shot in a park. Little kids cannot be in parks. Many of our children are policed in their schools. 50% of US public have a school resource officer at least one day a week, which is an armed law enforcement officer. Many of our patients are exposed at the doors of our facilities, sometimes also at their bedside when we disagree with their behavioral choices. And so we have to acknowledge that Black folks really lack sanctuary from racism and its forms of violence, or as colleagues and I said in the New England Journal, from the intersecting forms of violence that threaten and shorten Black lives. And so we have to talk about what it looks like and what it feels like to build sanctuary from those forms of racism within our institutions more broadly and individually in our own clinical practice. So today I want everyone to think about, as you leave today, what it could look like for you and feel like for you to build sanctuary from racism. Maybe your role is small. Maybe you're not the chair of the department. Maybe you're not a leader who is on the, executive team. Maybe you just work there. Maybe you're a trainee. Maybe you run a community project. In whatever area in which you have power, I want you to think about what it means for when patients interact with you or interact with the projects or resources that you've built for them, what it means for them to have sanctuary from racism in that experience. Finally, we have to come to confront whiteness. At the end of that long, hot summer of 1967, then President Lyndon B. Johnson put together a commission called the Kerner Commission that was made up of 10 individuals, most of whom were white men. And they reached a conclusion that's remarkably similar to the one that I think we are finding ourselves at the end of our summer of uprisings. They said, this is our basic conclusion. Our nation is moving towards two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. But this deepening racial division is not inevitable. The movement apart can be reversed. Choice is still possible. But what this predominantly white male commission said back in the 60s is that what white Americans have never fully understood, but what Black Americans can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the material conditions that ensnare Black communities. White institutions created those material conditions because they profit from them. White institutions maintain those material conditions because they profit from them. And white society then comes to condone the racial health inequities that live on the other side of that deep racial inequality. And so I also want everyone to think about what it might look like and feel like to confront whiteness and the many ways that it structures power and opportunity. Perhaps, again, it's just within your department or even just within your project or your individual relationship with patients. In whatever ways you have power, I want you to confront how whiteness shapes that power and how you can undo that. Ultimately, anti-racism is systems change work, but it requires a commitment to truth, reconciliation, and reparations. And again, those three things go together. It should look like processes to unlearn and dismantle that occur alongside processes to imagine and build new ways. And it should feel like loving sanctuary from oppression, from violence, and even from passive harm. Okay, I'm going to stop there and open it for questions.